welcome back to my channel, The Pharma Tutor. And today, the topic of discussion is chemical signaling between the cells, and in it, we are going to discuss different types of chemical messengers like hormones, local mediators, neurotransmitters, and we are also going to discuss membrane receptors, right? So before getting in detail, I want you to think about this, that have you ever wondered how your brain tells your heart to beat faster during fear? Or how does insulin know exactly where to act? How does one cell communicate with another when they are far apart? So today we will understand that, right? Chemical signaling between the cells, right? So here I'm drawing a simple flow diagram, and everything we will study, I hope that today it revolves around this one pathway, right? This is cell, right? It transfers the chemical signal to the receptor, and receptor produces the response, right? So this is the basic flow diagram, and everything we're going to discuss or we're going to study today, it would revolve around this very simple pathway, right? So now let us discuss the topic in detail. What is chemical signaling? What is it? Now, our body basically contains trillions of cells, and cells cannot speak, so they communicate by chemical messengers, right? So I want you to imagine, like, suppose this is cell A, right? And this is cell B here. So cell A is going to release some sort of chemical messengers in order to produce cellular response within cell B, right? And that can only occur when there is a sort of specific receptor for those type of chemical messengers, which can accept those chemical messengers and let them in within the cell, right? So this is simply chemical signaling, that it is a process by which one cell releases a chemical messenger that travels to another cell, as I already told you, binds to a specific receptor and produces a response in that target cell, right? Is that clear? Now, what are the types of chemical messengers, right? Chemical messengers are classified into three different types: hormones. Secondly, we have local mediators. And thirdly, neurotransmitters. Right? Now, the basic difference among all these three receptors is that how far they travel, right? You have to remember this question: how far do they travel? Right? This is the basic difference between these three types of chemical messengers, which means that if there is a hormone, so it travels long distances, and it travels towards the blood and enters into systemic circulation, and then travels to or produce effect in the effector organs, and then it produces the prolonged effect, right? So this is basically a long distance, right? So when we talk about the local mediators are sort of cells, neighboring cells, and one cell awake other cells through release of chemical messengers, as I told you. And when we talk about the neurotransmitters, so that is the immediate response through nerve impulse. So this is what makes all three types of the chemical messengers different from one another: the distance they travel. Now we will discuss all three messengers individually, right? First, we have hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers that are secreted by specialized endocrine cells, and when they are secreted, they are entered into the bloodstream, and then they travel through different regions of the body and throughout the body to produce the widespread effect, right? So let me draw a simple chart in front of you. From specialized endocrine cells, hormones travels through the blood vessels, and from blood vessels they travel to different organs of the body and then to the specific targeted cells like heart or kidney, liver, or you can say kidney, and then target cells. In fact, hormones travel the long distances, right? So now we have the target cells as the final region to reach, or final destiny. So target cells only have you can say receptors to respond. You can say that target cells only possess the receptors to respond, because if every cell receives insulin, for example, when I talk about insulin, that if every cell receives insulin, then why don't all cells respond? Why? Because only insulin receptors can recognize insulin and no other receptor, right? So that's how the specialized response is produced. This is the insulin molecule, right? Insulin hormone, and it travels to different regions of the body, but still it is only bind to the specific receptor that is made for this insulin in specific regions of the body, right? So you have to understand that only the specific targeted cells which contain the receptors for that specific hormone can only respond to that hormone. Now there are various kinds of hormones which are secreted from anterior and posterior pituitary. Like from anterior pituitary, there are FSH hormone, LH hormone, ACTH, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin hormone, and growth hormone. From posterior, there are two types of hormones like ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin and oxytocin, and they enter different regions of the body to produce the desired response. Now when I talk about the local mediators, so let me draw a diagram for you. This is again a cell A, right? This is stimulated by ANS stimulus, right? So this cell A has its neighboring cells to which it really want to stimulate and activate them to produce the response or cellular response, right? So what would happen actually, this cell A would start to release the chemicals. These chemicals would start to be accepted by the receptor that is present on the second neighboring cells, and this receptor would accept these chemicals, and then these chemicals would travel inside the cell, and as a result of which the response would be produced by this cell individually, right? Response would be generated, right? Now after producing the response, these chemicals would be removed, and they won't be distributed within the cell or different regions of the body, rather they would be destroyed, right? So you have to remember that they would be destroyed once their task is done. These chemicals do not enter systemic circulation and are easily removed and quickly removed, right? So what are the examples of local mediators? Some examples are like histamine, and moreover we have prostaglandins. These are all the signaling molecules which activate the neighboring cells, right? And we also have nitric oxide. You are going to discuss or study this nitric oxide later in detail. Oxides. These signaling molecules, they only talk to the neighboring cells and nothing else. After their task, they are just destroyed and they are removed from the cells. Here you can see the basic difference between the three, that the hormones, they easily enter into the bloodstream, and through the bloodstream they enter into the target cells in order to produce the response, right? When we talk about the neurotransmitter, then there are different types of neurons, and through the dendrites which are present on the neuron or cell bodies, they travel to the axon and travel across axon and to the effector cell to produce the response. And then when we talk about local mediators, then these are the neighboring cells which are stimulated by one another, and that is the activation of cells through release of signaling molecules. If I ask you that what if communication has to happen within the milliseconds. That is done by the nervous system and the neurotransmitters that are also the part of nervous system. So we discussed the previous two chemical messengers. Now we're going to discuss the neurotransmitters, which are the third type of chemical messengers. So here you can observe this diagram that you have in front of you. So this is basically a presynaptic neuron. You can say it's a presynaptic neuron, right? And this is a postsynaptic neuron, or you can say the target, or if targeted cells, or the effector organ, right? It can be targeted cell, it can be effector organ, anything, because we don't know. It can be postsynaptic neuron, targeted cell, or the effector organ. Now this is the region of synapse, right? So the chemical messenger or neurotransmitter helps to cross this gap, that is the synapse, which is present between two types of neurons, or neuron or the effector organ, right? So from the presynaptic neuron, this neurotransmitter would be released into the synapse, and from the synapse it travels to the effector organs and bind to the receptors and produce the response, right? Let me quickly draw it or write it to you, that how the neurotransmission occurs. We're going to take the overview of it. First step is action potential, right? Action potential arrives at the axon terminal. So action potential has to arrive at this axon terminal, right? This is the axon terminal in front of you. Then the voltage gated calcium channels, they need to open, right? The voltage gated calcium channel opens. Now these are the voltage gated calcium channels. They need to be opened, right? So once they opened, the calcium influx occurs. Calcium moves inside the presynaptic neurons. So this is the third step. Calcium enters the presynaptic neuron, right? The fourth step is that calcium signals neurotransmitter vesicles, right? So the calcium that moved inside the presynaptic neuron, it travels to these vesicles, and these synaptic vesicles contains the neurotransmitters. Now the neurotransmitters can be of any type, like they can be norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and epinephrine. So calcium reaches towards the vesicles, signals vesicles. Now what is the fifth step? That the vesicles move close to membrane and fuse to the membrane, right? So vesicles fuse to membrane of the presynaptic neuron, which means that these vesicles would move to this membrane. This is the membrane, right? This is the membrane. So they would fuse to this membrane like this. Once they fuse with this membrane, then the next step would begin, and that is neurotransmitters would be released from the membrane where exocytosis would occur, and the neurotransmitters, after fusing to this membrane, would be released from this membrane and travel to this synapse region, right? This is the region, and here you can see these small pink dots. These are the neurotransmitters. Now the seventh step is that the neurotransmitter bind to receptors. So these are basically the different types, or they can be single type of receptors that are present at the effector region, effector organ, or the postsynaptic neuron, right? So these are basically the effector, you can say the receptors. So neurotransmitter would travel to these receptors, and neurotransmitter would bind to these receptors, okay? So then the last step, signal initiated, where signal would be initiated in postsynaptic cell or the effector organ in order the response is produced. So these are the simple steps that are followed in neurotransmission, and this was all about the third type of chemical messenger, neurotransmitter. We had hormones, neurotransmitters, or local mediators. Now, why do we need receptors? The question is, why do we need receptors if we have three different types of chemical messengers all along that are transmitting different messages across the body, right? So the answer is simple and clear, that hormones, local mediators, and neurotransmitters, all three chemical messengers, they are hydrophilic in nature, which means that they are water loving and our membrane, but the difficulty or the problem is that membrane is lipid membrane, so they cannot penetrate where they cannot penetrate in the membrane. Now the whole process was done, all the chemical messengers, they travel to different regions of body, but when they reach the effector cell or the targeted cell, then they have the membrane, right? These targeted cells have the membrane. So how would they reach within the cell to produce the response? So for that purpose, we have the receptors that are present at the surface of the cell membranes. This is the cell. This cell has the different receptors, and these receptors, basically the chemical messengers bind to these either hormones or local mediators or neurotransmitters. They bind to these receptors in order to produce the series of change within the cells or the cellular response, right? So that's why receptors are used. Now, what are some of the most important and unique properties of the receptors that make them stand different is that they are quite protein in nature, and moreover the receptors have the specific binding, and this specific binding is so much important that not every receptor can bind to any chemical messenger. Exactly, that's what you should know, that if any chemical messenger travels to the specific cell, then it needs to have its own specific receptor to which it can easily bind, and thirdly, it produces cellular response, right? Here you can see these are the ligands or the chemical messengers. They, in order to enter within the cell, they needs to be bind to the receptors, right? So this is how they bind to the receptor in order to produce the intracellular response. Most important section of the video that you need to understand, that there are different neurotransmitters like glutamate, norepinephrine, epinephrine, acetylcholine, but still they all are needed for communication between the neurons, right? So based on the release of neurotransmitter, you should remember that the autonomic nerve fibers or the neurons, they are classified into two types of neurons. The first ones are the adrenergic neurons. Second are the cholinergic neurons, right? Now they are based on the type of neurotransmitter they release, which means that adrenergic neurons release acetylcholine and cholinergic neurons release norepinephrine, right? You all know that this is the presynaptic neuron, and this presynaptic neuron needs to release any type of neurotransmitter in order to produce response in the postsynaptic neuron, right? So these are of two types, adrenergic neurons and cholinergic neurons. They are further, adrenergic release acetylcholine, cholinergic release norepinephrine, and acetylcholine further can bind to or act on two types of receptors, right? You know that the postganglionic neurons have different receptors, right? So acetylcholine, if neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, then it can only bind to two different types of receptors if they're present on the postsynaptic neuron, and those receptors are the muscarinic receptors, and the second one is the nicotinic receptor. Similarly, when I talk about norepinephrine, if the norepinephrine is released from the presynaptic neuron, then it can also bind or act on two different types of receptors, alpha receptors or beta receptors. This is the overview. We will discuss these in later videos, and these receptors are collectively known as cholineceptors or cholinergic receptors, and these receptors are known as adrenoceptors or adrenergic receptors. Now they act on the target cells and postganglionic neurons, and then they produce the response, right? Once the acetylcholine bind to these receptors, then the response will be produced within the postganglionic neuron. Similarly, here the response will be produced once the neurotransmitter bind to the receptors, and then the response is simply generated, right? I am revising it for you all. If the neuron is cholinergic, then it releases acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter, and this acetylcholine acts on two types or bind to two types of receptors, the nicotinic or the muscarinic receptors, at the result of which the response is produced. Adrenergic neurons, if those are adrenergic neurons, then the norepinephrine would be released, and this norepinephrine would bind to only two receptors if they are present on the postsynaptic membrane, alpha or beta receptors, and then they produce a response, right? Now, if I talk about the drugs, so they are similar to acetylcholine or norepinephrine, just as we discussed earlier. So the drugs which we give to the patients, which we're going to discuss in the later chapters, so they are of two types: cholinergic and adrenergic drugs, right? Cholinergic, that binds to the cholinergic neurons, and adrenergic, that binds to adrenergic neurons. So further, the drugs are cholinergic agonist and antagonist. Talk about the drugs which we give to the patients and which we're going to discuss in the later 4 chapters. So they are either cholinergic or adrenergic, and among the cholinergic, they're further classified as cholinergic agonist and antagonist, adrenergic agonist and antagonist. Now, when we talk about the agonist, so you should remember that cholinergic or adrenergic agonists bind to same receptor as acetylcholine or norepinephrine, but activate them, and they produce the similar effects as were produced by the acetylcholine or norepinephrine, right? But when we talk about the cholinergic antagonist or adrenergic antagonist, then you must know that they bind to the receptor, same receptor as acetylcholine or norepinephrine, but they do not activate them, those receptors, and in result, they prevent acetylcholine or norepinephrine from binding and block their effect, right? So this is exactly what we'll study in next 4 chapters. We will learn about cholinergic agonist, which mimic acetylcholine, cholinergic antagonist, which block acetylcholine, adrenergic agonist, which mimic norepinephrine or epinephrine, or adrenergic antagonist that blocks the actions of norepinephrine or epinephrine. So remember one simple rule, that natural neurotransmitters produce body's normal response, while drugs either imitate that response like agonist or prevent it, antagonist. With this concept in mind, you're now ready to understand entire autonomic pharmacology section. So this is all about today's lecture. Hope you liked it. Thank you very much.